Welcome to NC Tweener Talks, powered by NC Idea, a weekly podcast by builders for builders, where we explore the startup journey from the idea to the exit and all the lessons in between, with an exclusive focus on founders from North Carolina. Now, here's your host, serial founder and general partner of the NC Tweener Fund, Scot Wingo.
First, a huge thank you to our platinum sponsor. NC Idea Foundation fosters sustainable economic development with competitive grants and programs for entrepreneurs and funding to strengthen the North Carolina entrepreneurial ecosystem. First, a huge thank you to our gold sponsors. Today, we are featuring Robinson Bradshaw. With national reach and deep triangle ties, Robinson Bradshaw delivers high-touch, sophisticated legal counsel to emerging growth companies and venture investors. We'd also like to recognize our silver sponsors. Today, we are featuring Bank of America. Bank of America's transformative tech group provides the stability and scalability that tech companies need to rapidly grow today and into the future. Thank you again to all of our sponsors for supporting the North Carolina Tweener Talks and the entire Tweener community. It takes an ecosystem to build a thriving community, and sponsors like these are invaluable. Welcome to this episode of North Carolina Tweener Talks. My guest today is Adam Steege. He is the founder and CEO of Trio Labs. They are in a additive manufacturing, which means they do 3D printing of super teeny tiny, that's a technical term, metal items for medical devices. This is our continuing series where we're looking at North Carolina companies that are doing things in the physical world, and it doesn't get more physical than building printers to print other physical things. So they're basically a manufacturing company, an innovator, and doing some really cool things right here in the Research Triangle Park area of North Carolina, in Morrisville, to be specific. I don't want to spoil it by telling you any more about it, so let's just jump right into the conversation with Adam. Enjoy. Welcome to this episode of North Carolina Tweener Talks. We are continuing our series where we're looking at awesome North Carolina companies that are building things in the physical world, as well as sometimes they'll have a software piece as well in that. Joining me today is founder and CEO of Trio Labs, Adam Steege. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
Yeah, you have. I'll start out by saying we've been a long-time investor. I forget how long. I want to say 2022. One of our earlier investments, and it's been a lot of fun watching you guys build. You've knocked down a lot of the hard things that you kind of talked about, 4 or 5 years ago building, and you've got one of the most fun tours in the Triangle. But we'll get back to that. So that's like the little teaser for folks to get excited. Let's start. I know a lot about your story, but let's kind of start. Let's back up and let's start at the Adam story. And how did you get into starting Trio? Is this your first thing you founded? And let's go back to where you're from, where'd you go to school, and how you got here in the Triangle building Trio. Tell us the story of all that.
All right. So just that then, just like the entire story to go into. All right.
Well, let's stop at Trio. Let's not reveal what you're up to yet.
All right. So yeah, going back a bit at the beginning. So this is my second startup company. My first one was in medtech. We were working on laparoscopic surgical devices. That first company started as my senior design project when I was a Mechie undergrad. So, I grew up in North Carolina, lived here for the first 18 years, went away for school for about 6 years, came back. So for all but 6 years of my life, I've been in North Carolina. When I went over for school, I did, it was a longer undergrad program, did math, physics, and mechanical engineering. 4 years out of Carleton College, 2 at Columbia. And then after leaving Columbia with that Mechie degree, took my senior design project and turned it into a company. And did that for about 5-6 years. And through that also have done a lot of consulting on the side. I think as most founders have encountered at some point or another, when you're first starting out, there's the startup you're working on for, 60 hours a week, and then there's the other 40 hours a week that you're putting into 2 or 3 other jobs to, pay the bills and so forth. So that was certainly my experience for the first, many years going through that. Really what that taught me was a few things. One, I love the med tech space. There's a lot of complex problems to solve. those problems, when solved, have a lot of impact. You can see, what this does for improving the standard of care, enabling clinicians to do better for their patients. All these things are really wonderful, really motivating things to get you to engage in problems as tough as what exists in this space. So through consulting, through that first startup, I got a lot of exposure to that. I also spent a lot of time, in machine shops making the actual things that we were developing. Right? It wasn't just designing, it wasn't just fundraising, it wasn't like all the early things that you usually see with a startup like that. I ended up very hands-on in a lot of that development. And so I got some exposure to what works and what doesn't work with a lot of existing prototyping and manufacturing methods, and that really became the genesis for Trio Labs. Was simplest way to summarize Trio is we've developed the tech that I wish I'd had back then, right, when I was designing those devices. And it's something that at the founding, that we had this thesis that I wasn't the only one facing those problems, and as we found, as we've grown, that's been absolutely true.
Yeah. It's unusual for a mech-y to run and start a company. Like where does that entrepreneurial gene come from? Unless Columbia is not like widely regarded as a huge entrepreneurial program that I'm aware.
No. And I would say, so I think in, what I've seen, certainly interacting with other folks in the startup ecosystem around here, and also, writ large, even other areas around the country, having a technical founder is very common. Having a technical founder who stays in the CEO role all the way through, levels of scale and so forth, far less common, right? And, candidly for me, that wasn't my expectation on day one, right? I came into this with a technical background, loving solving the technical problems. I didn't have a business background at that point. I've been fortunate to work with some incredible teammates, other executives on our team, incredible advisors and our board. And have grown into it as a result. I've discovered over the years a couple things. One, it's a role that I really enjoy, and two, it's a role that I can do. And both of those were learning processes. So you're absolutely right that it's not common to see that trajectory, but it's one where to me it comes from looking at sort of the same things that make engineering interesting, but at a higher level. What I mean by that is, when you're designing a solution to a technical problem, you're designing a system, you got to figure out what are your ins, what are your outs, how do you want to get the thing to do the thing, right? Running a company is the same. You're still trying to get the thing to do the thing.
It's a system, at a higher level. Inputs and outputs.
Yeah. Exactly. And the moving parts happen to be people instead of, different things that you're designing. And so there's inherently, I'd say, more complexity in that in a lot of ways. But it's still, it's complex problem solving at a high level, which is the type of intellectual pursuit that really gets me engaged.
Yeah. Once you've had, for me, once I had differential equations, finding my way around a P&L and a balance sheet was not a huge challenge. And you probably had more thermo than I did. So that stuff's gnarly. So
for sure. And it's, the finance side is basic arithmetic, just a whole lot of it,
Yeah. And there's some concepts like depreciation. That's like, okay, this is not even as hard as calculus. Yeah. So what happened with that first company?
The first company, unfortunately, was not, the big windfall that everybody hopes for the first time around. I did that for about 5-6 years. We got through early animal trials. What we found was, we were trying to solve a problem for a segment of the market that was much less visible to potential acquirers and partners. So we had this, what I would call stakeholder visibility mismatch, where the people who most had the problem were not the people who had the, agency, decision-making power, et cetera, when it came to acquiring that IP or finding a way to partner to bring it to market, that kind of thing. So it was unfortunate, right? I think this is a big learning for a lot of entrepreneurs, and especially in the healthcare space, right? Is finding where you have, the right problem, the right solution, and the right alignment of stakeholders in the entire stack to make that into a viable business, a viable opportunity. Again, this comes back to, really complex, high-level problem solving and really multivariate problem solving. That's one aspect of all this. And I think it's even more complex in healthcare when, if you're trying to sell to consumers, it's one thing. You're trying to solve for a consumer, you're trying to solve for distribution. There's a few layers in that chain. If you're trying to solve for healthcare, you are solving for the technical side, you're solving for the manufacturing side, you're solving for sales and distribution, you're solving for regulatory, you're solving for the procurement people at these hospitals, the clinicians, the patients. There's so many different layers of stakeholders that all have to align in order to make that work. So I think that was, a big learning for me coming out of that company was, pressure test all of those stakeholder preferences, those stakeholder needs as early as you can in the process to make sure that you are planning, structuring, building your business in the right way.
Got it. Yeah, and in medical, you have to have a destination for whatever you're building, because it if it's a drug, it has to land at big pharma. If it's a medical device, it has to land at like a device company that has all the infrastructure for going and doing that stuff.
Absolutely. And at a high level, what you're trying to solve for is however you participate in that ecosystem, as a device company, as a drug company, as a manufacturer, as a design house, whatever it is, you need to know who is going to buy from you. You need to know how they're making those purchasing decisions, and you need to make sure that you are solving a problem for them in a way where they're incented to engage. This, there's nothing complicated about that, that part of it. That's true for every single business. It's just that the number of people you're trying to solve for in healthcare is often significantly higher than a lot of other businesses.
Yeah, and they're moving targets. They don't wait around while you're building your company for 4 years. So that was not a huge windfall for you, but you dusted yourself off and got back at it. And then did Trio kind of emerge from the ashes of that, or is that kind of where you kind of conceptually came up with the idea?
Exactly. So, like I said, I spent a lot of time in machine shops developing devices for that company, and CNC machining is kind of the gold standard for precision manufacturing in that space. That's how a lot of people make components for medical devices. I wanted to use 3D printing for those devices. The existing technology at the time really didn't cut it. It was kind of a crude imitation of what I wanted to get out of it, but it wasn't really, it didn't perform at the level we needed to make end-use components for those applications. And that was certainly a struggle for me, where the things I wanted to design naturally lent themselves to a digital manufacturing process that has more design flexibility, but the existing processes in that category didn't perform at a level that really met spec, right? That could make actually functional things. So that was really the intersection. That was the crux problem that I wanted to solve, is bring the flexibility of 3D printing into medtech in a way where A, it performs well enough that you can even trust it for just designing new devices, but B, something that is scalable, economical, et cetera, so you can do it in volume. Because if you can make a new technology that it makes it possible to build things that you couldn't build any other way, that's great. That's impressive. That's the thing to celebrate. But if it can only really make 10 things, 10 pieces of something, it's an academic exercise. It's not a real business, and it's not disruptive by any stretch, right? Because it's not going to actually get to the patient. Unless you can make tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of things and do it economically, that's how you get to impact. So that was really what I would call table stakes for us when we were starting all of this. Is the tech had to perform at a level that no other technology had in this space before, and it had to be affordable, scalable, et cetera, so it could get to real volume production.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're in the world of has a lot of different words. Some people call it digital manufacturing. I think you like to call it additive manufacturing, or yeah. So give us kind of like the basic pitch for what Trio does now that we're kind of up to this point.
Yeah, so we do micro scale metal 3D printing, or additive manufacturing, or whatever you want to call it. There are a number of terms for it.
Yeah.
We make really small, complex metal components that go into medical devices. And the reason we do this is pretty much everything in minimally invasive care, if you talk about advanced surgical care, is getting smaller and more complex, right? Minimally invasive surgery has been around for a long time now, and has gradually made it into more anatomical spaces, more clinical uses. A lot of that has been we'd call either general abdominal use cases. So think like general surgery, taking out a gallbladder or an appendix. Some of it gets into GI or urogyne or other areas, sort of in the between the bottom of the rib cage and the lower part of the pelvis, is sort of that section of anatomy. There's been a lot of use cases for that developed over the past many decades. That's expanded gradually into minimally invasive thoracic surgery, where you're doing some cardiac procedures, things like that. Also, MIS techniques get seen a lot in orthopedic procedures. They've gotten better and better at doing a lot through smaller incisions. The other area we see a lot is in endovascular, so interventional cardiology. That's sort of the original space where you see catheters, where you're now accessing parts of the body through single small incisions in the leg, and then going through the bloodstream to access different anatomy. All these different approaches all come down to the same theme, which is try to access the target anatomy and do the thing you got to do with as few incisions and as little trauma to the patient as possible. And the challenge in pushing into new domains for this is you're pushing further and further into harder and harder to access anatomy, right? So a lot of the new developments in this are things like, endoluminal procedures. So there are companies developing bronchoscopic devices that go, in through the mouth, down the throat, into the lungs, and then do, either lung biopsies, can do diagnostics, intervention for lung cancer. You have even more complex endovascular procedures where you might even incorporate drug delivery, or you're trying to use, these endovascular devices not just for cardiovascular health, but for just accessing other organ structures and then operating on those more locally. Things like treating liver cancer and so forth. So there's a lot of novel use cases that get even better for the patient in that you can be less invasive with all of this and access a lot more of the body. But the instrumentation gets way more complex when you're trying to do that much interventionally in a small, flexible, long, skinny package. And so, we found that, this is exactly the trend that we're here to serve is everything is forced in that direction. Machining, molding, traditional methods, they run into some real challenges when you get into smaller and smaller parts. Physics starts fighting you when you're trying to cut things or mold things below a certain size and above a certain complexity. At the same time, on the other end of the spectrum, you got nanofabrication, so MEMS, wafer fab, semicon processes, things like that. Those do great at the nanoscale, but they don't often scale into the millimeter scales that you see from EdTech for these devices, and they don't really tend to make, say, biocompatible metal components. So there's this gap in between. If you're trying to make something in the exact size range and in the exact complexity range that all these applications demand, you start seeing classical techniques limit out as they try to get smaller. You see nanoscale techniques that can't really scale up to that size range. So you're kind of left, in this problem space that doesn't have a lot of great options. And that's precisely what we're solving.
Cool. So you had this idea, and then how did you, so there's a lot of different ways when you have an idea to kind of like push at it and see if it's going to be something you can solve. So one thing is like, can I solve this? So that's one way. And the other one is there demand for it? Which of those approaches did you take when you came up with the idea?
So it was a bit of both. I mean, I knew a bit of the demand side already because I was a customer before I started the company, right? So I was, the target customer for this, and I've certainly found that repeat as we've interacted with a lot of other engineers in the space, and a lot of our initial commercialization efforts were selling to R&D engineers developing new devices. Those are my people. That's the job I used to have. So I already knew a fair bit of what they needed. So the demand side, I think, at a high level, we had checked that box. Obviously, there's a lot more you have to do to vet that demand and really grow a business around it. But conceptually, we had a strong thesis, I think, going in. And so the focus early on was, okay, let's get the technical solution wrapped and let's make something that, meets what this market needs, right? And that was a long process. That was about 5 years. So that was, the early days of the company. I was on this full time. We had a few part-time folks also supporting, some of the engineering, some of the business side. But it was a long slog to go through. I think 4, 5, 6 major iterations of the technology and build all of these new printers, new processes from scratch in-house, at the bench scale before we had something where we looked at that and said, yeah, that's something we can start to commercialize. And once we had that bench scale proof of concept, then we went out, raised our Series A, built the industrial version of that so we could actually sell product to customers on that because we needed something better than a bench scale machine to actually make a saleable product. But that was, it was 2015 was about when we started the company. 2021, so it was actually more like 6 years, was when we raised our Series A, and then early 2023 was when we launched commercially. So it was an additional 2 years to go from benchtop to industrial version of the tech.
Wow. And okay, so I'm a novice on this. Explain for a novice what a benchtop is. Is that just kind of like a little toy machine kind of thing, or like is that what you mean by that?
It's when you're doing it at bench scale, you're basically saying, what is the version of this technology that I can build as quickly and cheaply as possible to prove that the basics of what I'm trying to do function the way I expect them to. And then from there, it may not perform as well as the ultimate version, but it at least checks the box that you're not, breaking the laws of physics to make the thing you want to make.
Yeah. And then what were some of the harder problems? So you've been at this since 2015, so for 11 years. So this is kind of like these things are never overnight success. But when you're building something that has a physical component, it takes a lot of iterating.
It
What
does.
iteration in your mind? What iteration are we on?
So it
Is
depends on
this like
which aspect of it you
V100
ask.
via like it, just like I'm sure you as an engineer, you kind of keep track of what version you're on. Like where would you say you are on the versions?
Honestly, I actually stopped keeping track. I stopped keeping track a while ago, especially as we've had a bigger engineering team and more of them are doing that. The other thing is we've gone through multiple different, I'd call revision methods. So we had probably 4, 5, 6 different major versions of the printer that I built largely. With our we had a fractional team at the time. In the first 5, 6 years, we then went to what we called our Gen 1 machine, which is our first what we call industrial scale. Industrial in the sense that it can produce saleable product that meets spec, right? So that Gen 1 machine was one that we moved to build and launched with in 23. We are now rolling out Gen 3. So 3 major revisions, I would say. And obviously, there's lots of small changes to make here and there, but on the equipment itself, I'd say third major revision since commercialization.
Yeah. Have there ever, in those first 11 years before you got even to commercialization, were there some panics where you thought you were stuck in a dead end and this wasn't going to work out? Like you couldn't get it small enough, or you couldn't get um, the scale right, the not scale, but the scaling up, the volume aspect of it right? Or are you a first principle type thinker where you're like, well, I know the physics is going to work, so I just got to navigate through it?
So I definitely tend to be a first principles person. That's what I look at even before I start something is just, okay, does this smell feasible, right? If it smells feasible, even if on that particular day it's being a bit of a pain, you at least have that check of, physics should allow this to happen. I just have to tweak it, figure out a different approach to something. So I wouldn't say that there were necessarily times when I looked at it and said, okay, we've run some kind of brick wall and physics won't allow this to happen. It was more just, okay, that's the thousandth attempt we've had on this particular way of doing it. So now we got to try something different.
Yeah. Help us understand for software nerds like me, what are the hard problems? So you got some metal, you squirt down so it's 3D printing. It's easy, right? You just like draw a little circle with the metal and then you just stack them on top of each other. Now you've got a little tube. What's hard about it?
That's a very good question. Some of that I can answer. Some of that is still
How hard
proprietary.
could it be? Seems like you could do this in a year. What took you so long?
So I think the way I would describe it is, one of our advisors is an ex-HP guy. He was actually president of 3D printing at HP, and the way he describes it is, before he ran their 3D printing division, he ran their entire printing division, so inkjet printing. It's about a $24 billion a year business back when he was running it. And having gone from the 2D printing world to the 3D printing world, the way he describes it is that third dimension is nonlinear. It adds a level of complexity that you fundamentally don't expect and don't see coming from 2D printing. And 2D printing, to be clear, is not a simple process. When you're trying to do precise material deposition, precise definition of geometry, all of that, those are complex processes. Our process is fundamentally a lithographic process. And lithography is something that's been around now, half century plus. I mean, if I look at the precision of our process compared to wafer fab, we are, cutting edge as of 1980, basically. Which at the millimeter size scale is actually plenty precise, but it's one of those, it's funny to look at that compared to what's happening in lithography. And that was, it took them a long time to get even to that level of resolution. And since then, we've, come down to the point where only one company on earth even can make that kind of equipment. The analog to that in our space is we're at a level of precision where we're the only ones on the planet that can make this level of precision for, this material set for 3D printing. So
you're the ASML of metal printing.
We're kind of half ASML, half TSMC because we're also selling parts as a service. We're doing the manufacturing ourselves, but it is that, I don't want to put it, it's not on par obviously with, 4 nanometer in terms of complexity. Those are another step up.
Let's hope your market cap is as big as those two companies.
Exactly. Yeah. But it is, the complex physics that they deal with, there are analogs for that in a lot of what we do. So it is, you're dealing with chemistry, you're dealing with physics, you're dealing with thermodynamics, you're dealing with controls, you're dealing with electronics, you're dealing with software. It is multi-physics at the core of it, and it is incredibly multidisciplinary in the execution of it. And that's really where a lot of the complexity comes from, right? You're trying to solve, none of the problems we solve is one-dimensional. There is no simple optimization. Everything is 10 to 20 dimensional problems that you're trying to optimize within that space, which is a big part of what makes it challenging, but also, really interesting. And also, as you solve those problems, that's what gives you a highly defensible moat.
Yeah. 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 I don't want any proprietary info, but just like simple. That's perfect. Perfect explanation. Another kind of noob question is why metal and not just like extruded plastic or something? Like, what is it about metal that is kind of where you landed for these medical devices?
So metal is a lot harder than plastic, and I don't just mean that physically. I mean it's a much harder thing to solve this problem for. So there's some advantage there on the business side. It's also part of the reason it's so difficult is you know you're solving not just the dynamics of the printing, but also any post processing, sintering, other things that go along with that. So on the technical side, I think there's some drivers there. On the demand side, though, plastics serve a certain need, metals serve a different need. If you want the mechanical, thermal, electrical properties of metal, then you cannot get that through polymers. Um, when we were looking at problems to solve, we were looking at this both from a perspective of how big is the problem, how much need is there for the solution, and then how defensible is the solution going to be, how economical is it going to be, that kind of thing. And I think that, both on the demand side, in that a lot of surgical devices use a lot of metal parts, and on the defensibility and uniqueness side, in that there have been far fewer solutions in the metal space than there have been in the polymer space for 3D printing. Um, there are some real advantages there. I think the other way I look at it is, and this comes back to the scale question, um, plastics manufacturing actually works pretty effectively with legacy processes. So, you know, injection molding, for example, right? You can injection mold a plastic part, and it costs pennies or fraction of a penny to produce that part. That's a really effective process, right? There may be some limitations to what you can make geometry-wise. It's a molding process, but it's a very effective process. And even further to that, when you get down to the micro space, if you're talking about these miniaturized devices, microplastic molding actually is a pretty well-established process, and you can make some insanely small parts out of plastic. The physics are fundamentally different when you're trying to do metal molding. So if you're trying to metal molding or machining, some of these other standard processes for metal, they don't scale very well into those size regimes, complexity regimes, the way that plastics do. So it's much more of an unsolved problem, much more of a blue ocean space to go after. Whereas if you're trying to do, say, high resolution plastic printing, you're competing against a legacy process that's already very cost effective and very well established for decades and decades.
Yeah. So you said on the demand side, there's some thermo things. Is it because certain parts of the body you don't want plastic in, or you need it to like, I know you've identified areas where metal is like, way better than plastic on the, for various reasons. I don't 100% understand the reason why.
Yeah, so a lot of it comes down to just physical properties. I'll give some examples. Robotic surgery. You're often trying to create grippers that can hold and drive a suture, can grip tissue, that kind of thing. When you're making really small parts, I mean, metal seems like this sort of impervious, super strong material. When you get down to a really small scale, it's not. It's just any other material. Now it is an order of magnitude stronger than any plastic, but you are in a situation where you may even be stressing the limits of what metals can do, which means you are way far away from what plastics could ever achieve. So just simple stuff, mechanical loads, what you need for that component to survive and operate effectively on the patient. Right, that's a big aspect of it. And then even beyond that, you go into other cases like electrodes and so forth for electrophysiology applications. If you need something that's electrically conductive for whatever reason, for mapping electrical signals in the body, that kind of thing, you're not doing that with polymers.
Yeah. Yeah. They need to be conductive.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's go from the micro to the macro. I've been on a tour of your facility, and it's pretty cool. Talk a little bit about the size. So you're out there. Last I visited, you were in Morrisville. Are you still in that same? Okay, and how big are these machines? Like, I don't want to know how they work, but like the super secret stuff. But like, is this a desktop printer? Is this a what? How big are these guys?
And they're more like a bit bigger than a big refrigerator. This is the easiest way to think about it. Like I said, it's a lithographic process, so you can kind of think of what we're doing as building a wafer fab in a box. That's the way that we think of the process. So there's a lot of, I'd say, mechanical complexity that goes into building a system like that. And so the irony is, and this is extends into the wafer fab place. The smaller you try to build your parts, the bigger your machines tend to get. Think of ASML as kind of the extreme version of this. Their 4 nanometer machines are like 3 or 4 school buses effectively. They're pretty massive. we're not quite that extreme, but you do run into that kind of situation where in order to build something that can, operate in a stable fashion, doesn't succumb to temperature shifts and so forth, you've got to build decent sized equipment in order to get those types of micro precision outcomes.
Okay, and then how talk a little bit about like what you're more to the company, like describe let's go back to the micro. Describe the types of parts you're making. These are like little needles. They're little. What are some of the kind of like configurations of these things, just so we can kind of try to envision how small these parts are, and like, are
Yeah.
they one of 1,000 pieces? Or are they like the needle the robot arm is using? Like, what are some of these things that you're making for folks?
So I think there's two major fields that we're operating in right now within the broader MIS space that are worth mentioning. So one is robotics, and the other is endovascular devices. Although inherently there is this convergence between the two, where people are using a lot more robotically driven systems in endovascular interventions, and some of the design space that we've seen in endovascular is starting to make its way over into endoluminal and other advanced robotics. But long, skinny snakes that you can control that go find their way through the body and that have something at the business end that then operates on the anatomy. The two biggest areas that we participate are in those, flex guidance systems. So lots of components that can articulate in various ways to have, dexterous control throughout the body. And the other is at the business end, whatever is operating on that final anatomy, be it, biopsy instruments or something else that is going to, either take something from the tissue or deliver something to that tissue.
Cool. And then give us an idea of. So you talked about some of the fundraising you've done. Give us an idea of the where you are in the company building process. It's you're 11 years into this thing. Where are you in the whole process in your mind?
Yeah, we're in the scaling process. I mean, that's the easiest way to put it is, there was the, what I call phase zero being the first 5, 6 years, just getting to proof of concept on tech, phase one, commercializing tech and getting initial product market fit, and then phase two right now is what I'd call, taking that and just doing what we've been doing, but 1,000 times more of it. Right. That's the phase that we're in right now. Is we've done enough work with enough different companies, supporting them in R&D, and then getting even into late stage development, supporting V&V and so forth, that now we're actually having companies, launched commercial devices leveraging our technology. That is starting next year. That's where we're going to be. That's a really exciting stage to be in, because it means now we're not in the whiteboard in the lab anymore. We're actually serving real patients in the clinic.
Yeah. What's next for you? Like, where do you see this going? Do you are you at that point now where you're really well known for what you do, and customers are coming to you saying, hey Trio, I need you to solve this problem for me? Or like how do you solve that chicken and egg problem? Do you just go ahead and build a bunch of things you think people will need, or every customer comes in and you're kind of everything is kind of custom, or how does all that work?
The nice thing is it's a digital process, so regardless of what the customer needs, it's the same core technology and same production process on our end. So we can work on 1,000 different programs all at the same time, serve their needs with equal levels of dexterity, versatility, and so forth, and how we operate. And then as those programs move to commercialization, then we scale along with them. I think where we are in terms of the company is I think we're well known certainly in certain areas by various companies that we've worked with. There's still room for us to grow. There's a lot of a lot of headroom left for us to make this a lot bigger. So that's our focus.
Yeah. Yeah. Any plans to go into other verticals or materials or anything like that, or just gonna just stay focused on the thing you've been working on for so long?
I think the focus is likely to stay very much in med tech for quite a while. I think there are other verticals certainly we can address over the long haul, but I think a critical challenge for every startup is focus. And without that, you often don't survive. If you try to be everything to everybody, you're often nothing to nobody, right? And we've certainly seen, we've seen this happen to other additive manufacturing companies, other folks in the 3D printing space, where they tried to say, develop a portfolio of 20 materials and 3 or 4 different major tech platforms and go after 6 different verticals. And they're in, oil and gas and aerospace and defense and medical and consumer and all of these things. And you just get so diffuse when you take that approach that you never get really good at executing on any one thing. which means you have a really hard time getting penetration in any of those spaces. And for us, like I said, my background's in med tech, so I know the med tech space, and I think that's really helped us execute there. As we've grown the team, we've hired people in the sales function who also have similar technical backgrounds in the med tech space. So when they go out, they are interacting as a peer with folks that are developing in this space and not purely as a salesperson trying to push something on them. And that's, it's something that sort of sounds obvious when you hear it, but it's not often very well executed. And I think that's something that has made us really unique in this space. So I think, keeping that focus and keeping, that mode of building the team to really address the customer in the right way for this particular segment, that's something we're going to be doubling, tripling, 10xing down on, I think, before we move into, other verticals.
Yeah, is there ever a day where you can? I know some of the 3D printing companies have, pre-made libraries of things, and you can just go and order them, or they'll have things like upload your spec and get a quote type deal. I imagine it's very bespoke right now. Is there a world where you can make it more online, kind of price and quote type thing, or is it always got to be kind of bespoke how you interact with customers?
So I think what we make for customers will always be bespoke. The way we execute on that can become more and more automated and more efficient. And certainly there are, software tools we can bring to bear on that as we scale. That's very front of mind for us. But the core value in this type of fabrication technology is the versatility, the fact that it can make everything, right? I think the crux problem is a lot of 3D printing companies have said, hey, just you can make everything, therefore you should print everything, and that's not really the case. So you got to look for those areas where you really lend value, where that design flexibility, the ability to make complex things really materially adds value to the thing that it's being incorporated into. But it is that ability to solve for complexity, that versatility, that is kind of the core value proposition for a tech platform like this. And so that's obviously where we focus.
How much, if there was a pie chart of your solution today, how much is kind of the software running the machine, and how much is the mechanical part? Is it like 100% mechanical still, or is there a fair amount of software in the mixer?
There's a lot of all the above. I mean, you're dealing with not just a complex set of physics, chemistry, and so forth. The other considerations. You have controls that run this. You have to deal with 3D data that you're importing and processing to load into instructions for the printer, essentially, on how to process that to produce a part. So there is a significant software component already. And certainly as you look at, automating workflows and scaling up, then the amount of software only increases.
Yeah, it seems like another challenge is deciding to your focus thing is like, I'm sure people have come to you and said, can I just buy one of your machines? And that's an interesting decision point, because short term, that may be great because there could be like this huge revenue win, but then have you just created a competitor, or have you gotten rid of the proprietary piece you have has kind of left the barn? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, it's a great question. As of right now, we don't sell equipment. Our go-to-market is really based around selling components. And that started from the perspective of, a lot of folks in 3D printing started by selling equipment. And it's not cheap, right? They're often, I think a lower cost, what I'd call production-ish type machine in additive manufacturing often goes for 100K, 300K, 500K. A lot of these printers can even go, especially in the metal space, they stretch well into the $1 million plus range. So you're asking someone to spend 6 or 7 figures on CapEx to solve a problem they may not even have. Mm-hmm. That's a tough proposition.
Yeah, they may want a prototype, and that's
yeah.
They may never get the prototype device implemented if there was such a big hurdle.
Well, I think the key thing is, it's not about having the printer. It's what are you going to make with it, right? If you haven't demonstrated that you have something that you want to make, that you need to make with this type of process that has a lot of value and that justifies buying one or more of these machines, then you're going in spending a lot of money on CapEx with a questionable value proposition. And what ended up happening in the additive space is a lot of capacity got pushed for not necessarily fully validated value propositions, and this caused problems for a lot of companies. On the flip side, pushing parts first means that we are providing something to the engineers that we serve that they needed anyway. That they can spend a few $1,000s and learn about the technology and see what it can do and solve for the design that they were trying to prototype that week at the same time. So it's a low friction way of engaging. It's something that provides value on day one, and it's something that gradually provides more value as they learn more about the tech and better ways to use it. So that mode of engagement has served us really well as a way to go to market. Will we ever sell machines? Potentially. I think it would be a little foolish to say that one business model is going to be the correct business model for all verticals at all stages of growth from now until the end of time, right? You have to be more adaptable than that, I think, when building a business like this. But for the time being, the model we have has really served us quite well.
Excellent. Appreciate you taking time to share your story. I know you're super busy dominating the world here. If people want to learn more about Trio Labs, they should go to triolabs.com. And then are you a frequent poster on LinkedIn or any of the places like that where folks can kind of read more about what y'all are up to?
Yep. Our marketing folks are frequent posters on LinkedIn, not necessarily me personally, but yeah, certainly through LinkedIn and through our website are the best ways to learn about us and reach out to us.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam, for coming on North Carolina Tweener Talks, and congratulations on being around for 11 years. That in itself is worthy of a little pat on the back. And then for all the really cool things that you're inventing right here in North Carolina.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
NC Tweener Talks is hosted by Scott Wingo, presented and produced by NC Tweener Fund, which is powered by NC Idea, with creative assets and design support from our friends at Walk West. That's it for today's episode. A big thank you to our guests, sponsors, and the team that makes this podcast possible. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who loves the startup stories coming out of North Carolina Tweener Talks and the entire Tweener community.